Welcome back to Let's Get Oral. I'm Jonathan Dornell, and in this episode, we have a very engaging and exciting conversation with Jason Nesta, an oral care and oral health expert, well versed in the chemistry and product development, and we're really excited to dive into the ins and out of hydroxyapatite as a compound, an ingredient, and a tool in the oral care toolkit. Before we get into the interview, I do want to provide a couple quick updates for you all. First, just wanted to call out, it was great seeing everyone at RDH under one roof. Definitely had fun with Camille wearing our new swag and suits. It was great to also connect with so many hygienists and people in the community, from whether they're new or well seasoned, and learning about their different contributions and impacts, and just how eager everyone was to learn from each other. So I was grateful to share that space with everyone, and I look forward to being able to do so again in the future. Second thing, the speaker circuit's begun with all these conferences and whatnot, so I look forward to being able to see Camille continuing to share her story and her knowledge. And I'm also looking forward to be able to do my part later this fall at Supply Side. And it's hard to ignore some of the tools and things that help to keep me focused while also juggling personal goals and responsibilities and balancing all that with work deadlines, the podcast, being able to keep things at a certain quality and standards, while also building spaces for friends and community. So I do lastly want to call out one thing that's been very helpful in this journey over the last few months has been my introduction and integration of Magic Mind. Magic Mind is a mental performance shot that utilizes nano encapsulation technology to deliver a blend of highly studied and safe nootropics. And for those of you who know me, I tend to prefer supplementing from whole food sources and whatnot. And I appreciate being able to integrate something like this that works well with my coffee consumption routine while mitigating that afternoon slump that can happen after lunchtime and like my lunchtime walk. If this is your first time to consider it or your first time hearing about it, for a limited time, you could use our unique code when you go to magicmind.com/LGO50 to make your first purchase, whether it's a subscription or a one-time purchase of a pack of these Magic Mind shots. They taste great. Got a mixture of some mushrooms, some matcha to give that bitterness profile, but also some citrus and sweet notes, but not too sweet. So again, highly recommend it. Give it a shot. I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's something I've been using for the last 30 days or so, and it's fully been integrated into my day-to-day routine, and can definitely tell how it's helped me to stay focused and keep all those things balanced. Now here's our episode with Jason Nesta.
Let's get oral. Let's get oral.
Hello. Welcome back to Let's Get Oral. I am Jonathan Dornell, one of your lovely co-hosts here with the LGO crew. Once again, sitting here with the lovely Camille Zenobia.
Hey, hi.
Howdy. It's nice seeing you again. It's nice seeing you just a few days ago. And today we have another fantastic guest who's joining us to talk a bit about hydroxyapatite. We want to introduce y'all to Jason Nesta. Not only is he a OG friend of the pod, he's also a former colleague from our Colgate days, and he is a well-established scientist and teacher. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thank you, Jonathan and Camille.
Yeah, I can't wait to dig into this subject. Yeah, We have these sidebar conversations all the time because I want to know more. And uh, hydroxyapatite is a big deal right now because fluoride is getting all sorts of bad publicity. So what's next? So
A bit understated.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly. And I know offline we talk a lot about oral care products, and especially with your experience both on the ingredient and product development side of things. So I think this a good place to start on this subject and this type of ingredient is a bit higher level for ourselves and for our listeners. Could you first tell us what exactly is hydroxyapatite and how it relates to our teeth and oral health?
Sure. So hydroxyapatite is a mineral. It is a form of calcium phosphate, and it is the primary inorganic component of your teeth and your bones.
I've heard it's been called biomimetic. Do you feel like this is an appropriate term?
Yes and no. So yes, if it has a similar crystal structure to the hydroxyapatite in your teeth, then it would be biomimetic.
So is that not the case for most of the in-market hydroxyapatite products?
No, I think it is the case for most of the in-market hydroxyapatite products, but it's not necessarily the case. There's a, most of the, so I think it's estimated something like 80% of what is sold as as tricalcium phosphate is actually hydroxyapatite, and this has, you know, tons of uses in different industrial applications. I mean, you can use it as a soil amendment, you can use it as a calcium fortification in, foods. You can use it. It has absorption properties. It can be used in, filtration applications. So, it's very broadly used material.
Does that have remineralizing capabilities?
It can have remineralizing capabilities when it's formulated right properly into an oral care product, not necessarily a toothpaste, mouthwash, maybe even, we're seeing a lot of things like chewing gums and mints and lozenges now on the market. The evidence to support their use right now is pretty minimal.
Yeah, those clinical trials are tricky. Yeah, in fact, why don't you walk us through some of the clinical trial hurdles since we're at this juncture?
Sure. Well, I think you mentioned this actually previously on one of your pods, but there's an ethical hurdle with clinical studies, and because fluoride is so well understood and so widely available and such a routine part of the majority of the world's population when it comes to oral hygiene, kind of withholding fluoride from a subject during a clinical study is widely considered to be unethical. So, if you want to look at the remineralization benefits of hydroxyapatite, comparing them to a placebo where the person has no remineralizing ingredient is an ethical challenge.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately, hydroxyapatite and fluoride are just not chemically compatible. Hydroxyapatite, as I mentioned earlier, is a form of calcium phosphate. It has a high amount of bioavailable calcium, and calcium and fluoride react to form calcium fluoride. And when this happens, in your mouth when you brush your teeth, it's a good thing. But if it happens in the toothpaste tube, then that fluoride will, be less or completely unavailable in your mouth for remineralization. So, this is sort of a big issue with doing clinical studies specifically on the remineralization aspects of hydroxyapatite. It's not as much of a hurdle if you wanted to look at, for example, the hypersensitivity benefit of hydroxyapatite.
So the precipitate that forms between the two molecules, that still acts as a benefit to somebody with hypersensitivity that is from exposed dentin tubules?
That precipitate doesn't necessarily act as a benefit, but it also doesn't impair the benefit of hydroxyapatite for hypersensitivity. So
Interesting.
hydroxyapatite as a hypersensitivity agent uses a mode of action that we call occlusion.
Right.
Hypersensitivity is caused when, either your gums recede from the teeth or your enamel erodes or is thinned, and the underlying level, the dentin, is exposed. And this is a porous level. It's still mostly hydroxyapatite, I think about 65%, but it's very porous, and those pores are filled with a fluid. And once that outside is exposed, that fluid can move, and this causes pain. This is the nerve, senses that as a really sharp, uncomfortable pain. And this can be due to temperature changes. It can be due to physical touch. So, with occlusion, essentially what you're doing is you're putting a physical barrier over those open tubules to prevent that flow. You're sort of mechanically restoring the environment that was there before, where they were no longer exposed to the oral cavity. And your hydroxyapatite particles, they can lodge into there, and it's whether fluoride is bound to them or not is really not going to have a big effect on their ability to do that. But the fluoride itself is not going to be as available for remineralization and integration into the tooth enamel to form fluorapatite because it's now externally bound to this other particle.
Got it. I mean, I always thought, I didn't realize kind of the precipitate formation would impair the availability, but I did think that having two in the same formula to remineralization opportunities, that one would outcompete, or there would be just a holistic ceiling effect.
Yeah, so for remineralization, what's been shown clinically, there's a dose response, right? We see this with fluoride, we see this with hydroxyapatite. If you have a toothpaste with 400 parts per million fluoride versus a toothpaste with 1,000 parts per million fluoride, both of them will have, an end clinical benefit of a reduction in tooth decay. But the 1,000 will have a better, stronger benefit. And that's, essentially most of the fluoride toothpaste on the market in the US are at that 1,000 parts per million. For hydroxyapatite, where we see that maximum benefit is around 10%. So if you were to take 10% hydroxyapatite and about 0.25% of fluoride and put them into the tube together, your fluoride, which is very electronegative, has a very strong desire to react specifically with calcium, is pretty much all going to react. Your available fluoride is going to go down very quickly to, nearly zero. But you're going to have such a superfluous amount of hydroxyapatite compared to the fluoride that there's still going to be a lot of available hydroxyapatite that's not reacted at all with fluoride to function. So likely you still will get a benefit from the hydroxyapatite, but the fluoride will mostly be used up and not available for remineralization.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, when we're talking about, I know I just stole your question, Jonathan, but I'm moving on to the different types and sources of hydroxyapatite. We get caught up in this current conversation around nano and micro hydroxyapatite. Can you tell us kind of how we manufacture hydroxyapatite in the wild here for toothpaste formulation? Uh, where we derive it from and what the difference are in the molecular size and shape and how that all plays out in a formulation?
Yes, so that's a great question. This is an area that is unnecessarily complicated. Most of what I'd say what the lay person is going to read about hydroxyapatite is usually around nanohydroxyapatite. That's sort of the sexiest, form of hydroxyapatite. But to your
Was it
point,
the
it's
first one? Was it the first being deployed or
in toothpaste, yes.
okay.
So this, the story, the old wives' tale with some truth, right, is that like NASA gave nanohydroxyapatite toothpaste to the astronauts,
Yes, that's what I've
which
read.
is which is, as far as I know, not technically correct. I think
Okay.
back in the 70s, so a long time ago, some scientists at NASA had patented the idea of developing a toothpaste with brucite, which is a precursor to hydroxyapatite. And you would brush your
Mm.
teeth with this toothpaste that has the brucite, and you would crystallize hydroxyapatite in your mouth while brushing.
Wow.
So
Fancy.
that was an idea, right? That was filed into a patent because many patents are ideas and not necessarily applied.
Yes,
So
true.
this patent was acquired by a Japanese company whose pronunciation I will likely butcher, but I believe it's pronounced Sanji or Sangi Medical.
Okay.
And after, failing to apply this idea as it was described in the patent, they said, well, what if we just make toothpaste with hydroxyapatite? So they made toothpaste with hydroxyapatite, and the first hydroxyapatite toothpaste was launched in Japan in, I want to say, 1983, maybe. So quite a long time ago, 50 years or so.
What was the brand? Do you know?
It was called either Apident or Apigard. I'm not positive. They're both brands made by this company. I believe they're even still marketed today.
Okay.
But but that was an application of nanohydroxyapatite, and since then, they've gotten better at making even smaller nanohydroxyapatite particles. So I think today, a lot of the toothpaste with nanohydroxyapatite has these 20 nanometer particles. I think back then it was around 100 or 200 nanometers.
Do we think that any of them are more significant than others, or why is the goal to get them smaller?
So the goal to get them smaller is to make them work better, particularly for remineralization, with the idea that the smaller the particles are, the better that they can fit into these microscopic cracks and lesions in your teeth.
Okay, fair enough. I know that there's a lot of fear-based discussions around the teeny tiny molecules also getting into cells and causing damage that way. Do you think that there's evidence for that?
I think is there evidence for that versus is there evidence against that are two different questions. Yes, I mean, we absolutely know that when you get to that size of particles that they can enter cells, they can pass through cell membranes, they can interfere with cellular processes. So this is widely known that it's possible to happen. Now, whether or not it does happen at this point in time is, I would say, not widely understood. And, it may not be widely understood for 10 or 20 or 50 years. Unfortunately, that's kind of the world we live in. Anything that's been around for a long time has a lot of negative correlations
Right.
because we have a lot of evidence versus things that are new. We don't have history and we don't have evidence, so there's not that many bad things known about it.
Sure. as somebody who does host microbiome interactions, there are zillions of studies that look at bacterial uptake and phagocyte uptake. So these are innate immune cells that are throughout our bodies, tasting our environment to evaluate what's there and report back to our immune system to say, hey, we should do something or not. And so there's a ton of research on just microparticles, tiny particles of all sizes being dressed with different topicals, if you will, or even joined with different chemicals to see what their uptake would be, how effective it could be, if we could alter cellular activity that way. And all of that is true and can happen under certain circumstances. But is it so targeted? You could imagine, I could imagine as a microbiologist that small particles in the mouth would be absolutely phagocytosed and eaten up by our cells to be evaluated, and that most of them are not going to inspire much reactivity because we have a lot of pathways involved in the mucosal tissues that create tolerance, because we want we want to provide tolerance to our environment for the most part. We want to get along with everybody for the most part. And but you could theorize that I have a tiny particle and there's tons of bacteria in there, and they're also tiny, and they could all stick together and be phagocytosed all at once. So it's kind of a messy process. But I mean, something that like hydroxyapatite that we do, it is part of our makeup, in that we do produce our own. So I have a hard time believing that it would so holistically change our cellular pathways, because I think that we've seen it before. It gets broken down and rebuilt all the time, just like everything else. There's a regenerative breakdown process that is occurring all the time in our bodies. And so I have a hard time believing that it would be so catastrophically signaling differently as a topical form. But that's just my 2 cents of kind of understanding the nuts and bolts of that cellular play in the mucosal tissues. But, TBD always. And then like full formula, how do all the other components play in? Those are always ongoing questions. But could you tell us how it's manufactured and kind of where we get it from when we're going to be using it in a formula? And are there better or worse sources, or are they all the same?
Yes, thank you for circling back. I think I avoided that question unnecessarily. So manufacturing, let's say we could sort of group things into three classes. We have natural origin, which is a very industry term, and
Wait,
then
are they
synthetic.
grinding up humans for this?
Humans, no, but animals, yes, right? So
Got it.
mentioned earlier, hydroxyapatite is the main inorganic component of our teeth and bones, and in the global economy, we process a lot of animals for meat, and we don't have, necessarily as much interest in their bones. So the bones can be dried and pulverized and ground into a powder, and there you have, natural hydroxyapatite, natural biomimetic hydroxyapatite with, some to some extent the same uh, nutrient composition as what we would have, and this could be used in toothpaste. It's not widely used in the personal care industry because we have a very complex relationship with animal derived products.
Yes, I
So
appreciate that.
even
But
though we're
also I could see how there would be potential issues of sensitivities, just because you do get other kind of animal proteins hijacking along, not hijacking, but like maybe not purified out all the way. And for some sensitive people, that might be a problem.
yeah, I mean, I don't know, but I think the drying part is probably going to denature most proteins. What's
Fair
what
enough.
is remaining, I'm not really sure. But I mean, irregardless, this is not very commonly found in our oral care products that you're going in and buying
Sure.
online or at the shelf. Um, and these are also going to have a tendency to be larger particles, so they would be, what we would refer to as microcluster or microcrystalline hydroxyapatite, because the smaller you grind those particles, the more time and energy that takes. And to get something down into the nano size would be, ultimately quite expensive. So your second form is, I'm going to just say, let's go straight to synthetic hydroxyapatite. So this is just hydroxyapatite that is purely made in the lab from, chemical reagents, some calcium source like a calcium chloride and some phosphate source. And, in this type of manufacturing, you have the most control over aspects of the chemical reaction like pH and temperature, salinity, whatever it might be. That's going to help you to form the particles that are the size and shape that you want. So this is what's going to be most commonly used to make the hydroxyapatite that we see in like medical applications like bone grafts and um, tooth transplants. That's not the right word. I sound like such an industry guy. Uh, but these nano hydroxyapatites, they're also used in toothpaste and mouthwash. And this is sort of, going back to that original hydroxyapatite toothpaste launched in Japan in the 80s, right? This was the type of hydroxyapatite that was using. And then the third one, it's sort of a quasi-synthetic, quasi-natural. That's what we call in the industry natural origin. So all of the starting materials are natural and the processing is pretty limited and only certain kind of reactions that occur in nature are permitted. And in this case, we would be using something like eggshells or oyster shells or limestone, some natural source of calcium, and convert it using, again, some natural reactions that occur in nature into hydroxyapatite. And here you could, feasibly, depending on what you did, you could create a nano or a micro hydroxyapatite. So this sort of natural origin and then the synthetic are going to be what's most commonly found in your toothpaste.
Do you have any opinions on what is better?
I mean, I know how I would spend my money if I was manufacturing a toothpaste. I think, I don't know if I'd use the term better. So what has been found, I think, pretty broadly by independent researchers are that these nanohydroxyapatite particles agglomerate and form, clusters that are 1 to 2 microns in size and, generally like round or spherical. And they're still finding these to be, effective, right, in clinical studies. I know we haven't gotten into the efficacy yet, but work with me, so they're finding that if you use a potentially very expensive, maybe 100 to over $1,000 per kilogram, nano
Wow.
hydroxyapatite, that when you make a toothpaste formula, you have particles that function in practice as 1 to 2 micron particles, versus getting a much more cost effective, micro hydroxyapatite source. I mean, that's how I would spend my money. But certainly, if we deep dive, especially into in vitro studies, we'll see, that they're showing more or stronger benefits from, the smaller particles.
As far as remineralization.
Remineralization and other benefits, all the benefits. I mean, hydroxyapatite is, it's reported to remineralize, it's reported to prevent or to stop hypersensitivity. It's reported to have some antibacterial benefits. Um, so, these are typically shown, if you look at in vitro, to be stronger with the smaller particles. But when we get into the in vivo / clinical space, then we're seeing, not to say that particle size isn't a factor, because if you have a 15 or a 20 micron particle, this is really too big. And, we can get into the sort of mode of action of hydroxyapatite, and we'll explain that. But when you're in the smaller, like sub 5 micron particles, I'm not sure that anyone's shown a real strong benefit to having a 20 nanometer particle.
Understood. Well, okay, so you mentioned MOA. Let's get into it. Tell us about the MOA and how it's different specifically from fluoride.
That's another good question. People often look at hydroxyapatite in oral care as an alternative to fluoride. And I think it's important for people to understand that fluoride and hydroxyapatite do two different things.
Yes.
Fluoride changes the chemical structure of your tooth. And it replaces a hydroxyl group in hydroxyapatite, and you end up with a mineral component that's now called fluorapatite. And fluorapatite is both harder and more acid resistant than hydroxyapatite. So when acid is, the end all be all bad guy for your teeth, having something that's more acid resistant is very good. And this is why fluoride is so effective. Of course, that harder part it could be a negative, right? Because if you have too much fluoride, then you become brittle and you can break and shatter. And, this is, I think, more of an issue with bones than it is with teeth, but it is a present sort of downside of fluoride. Hydroxyapatite, does not do that. It does not make your teeth harder or more acid resistant. Hydroxyapatite essentially supercharges your body's Riemann-Diemann process. This thing that's happening in your mouth all the time. You eat food, bacteria digest sugars, they make acids, the pH in your mouth goes down, your teeth release calcium. That's demineralization. Your body produces saliva. The saliva has buffering capacity. It also has calcium and phosphates. pH in your mouth goes back up. You get above 6.5. You enter what we call Riemann. Your saliva is supersaturated with calcium and phosphate. You deposit calcium phosphate on the surface of your teeth. And this gets, some of it gets integrated back into the enamel, remineralizing those partially demineralized lesions. This is happening, all day, every day. And if you want to have good oral health, right, you want to move the balance towards remineralization. You want to do simple, healthy things like drinking some water or chewing some sugarless gum after you eat so that you recover your pH faster. You want to not be a mouth breather like me so that your tissues are nice and wet and your saliva is doing the best that it can do instead of spending all night in demon, probably exacerbated by my mouth guard.
I was going to say, do you want to tape that?
Right. Of course, there's going to be these comparisons and asks that you've done with explaining between fluoride and hydroxyapatite in isolation, in addition to what they look like in combination in certain formulas. Do we know much about how hydroxyapatite might behave or interact with other actives that's not fluoride that could be targeting, say, gingival health or halitosis in some of these oral care products?
So I don't think that There's been a ton of research focused on specific interactions. Certainly here and there, I'm sure some researchers and some brands have done some studies. When we look at hydroxyapatite and the way that it works, it is, again, it's that same mineral component that your teeth are composed of. So everything that sticks to your teeth wants to stick to hydroxyapatite. And since these hydroxyapatite particles are small, they also sort of want to stick to those things. So if you think of your acquired pellicle or your dental pellicle, right, this sticky protein layer that adheres to your tooth enamel, well, hydroxyapatite particles, they want to stick to that. Your biofilm, your plaque bacteria, they stick to your tooth enamel. Well, these hydroxyapatite particles want to stick to that. So when you brush your teeth or use a mouthwash with hydroxyapatite, the way that it works is that these particles, they stick and they're retained in your mouth. Now, if you read, some papers maybe will glorify this and they say you create this homogeneous synthetic enamel layer on the outside of your teeth. If you can read some other papers, they're going to say, you create this heterogeneous layer where there's, some hydroxyapatite particles here and there, but it's not very consistent. And, maybe they're all different sizes and the median size is, somewhere between 500 nanometers and 1.5 microns. But the way that it acts to help with remineralization is once those particles are there, they sort of do three different things. One of them is that they act as a sacrificial medium. So when there is acid, instead of minerals being released from your teeth, these minerals can be released from these particles that are sitting at the surface that are, integrated into your biofilm or however they're stuck there to the teeth. So you're sort of saving your teeth by donating this calcium and phosphate. So then the second thing is they're going to help recover the pH because phosphates have some buffering capacity and they're going to drive that pH up towards neutral and back to remineralization. And the third is now that they're going to donate calcium and phosphate ions. So they're going to reinforce and sort of fortify the amount of calcium and phosphate that's in your saliva that's then available to be taken back up into the teeth for remineralization. So there's a particle size aspect to this that is, right, the smaller the particle, the more surface area for a reaction to take place. But what we're finding, even if you make your toothpaste with a 20 nanometer particle, is that the particles that are on the teeth, these aggregates, are typically north of 500 nanometers, up to, maybe 1.5 to 2 microns with that long tail of even larger particles. How these interact with other ingredients often has to do with the chemistry of those other ingredients. So we've already talked about fluoride, right? Fluoride really wants to bind to calcium. If you put fluoride and hydroxyapatite together in your toothpaste tube, they're probably going to react, and that fluoride is not going to be bioavailable when you brush your teeth. If you look at, other ingredients that are, maybe for gum health benefits, for gingivitis, you're just going to look at the chemistry, and really are they going to react with calcium, and what is going to be the outcome of that reaction?
So I know fluoride was basically a miracle to get into a formulation when it happened. It took a while. But this seems to be a little bit more friendlier to formulation. Are there specific challenges that are similar or different around the formulation process between the two different actives?
It is less challenging, I think, than fluoride. Fluoride is the most electronegative. It really wants to bind. It really wants to react. Fluoride wants to pair up with something. Hydroxyapatite, not so much, right? Hydroxyapatite, it's already a calcium phosphate particle, so it's sort of already reacted, and for it to work in your mouth, those particles just kind of have to get stuck there, and then just through the chemistry of your mouth, that Demon-Riemann cycle, those calcium and phosphates are going to be liberated and be available to be taken up into your tooth.
So what
The
you're
biggest watch out, though,
okay.
it's not. So the biggest watch out is pH. You don't want to have an acidic environment. I mean, we just talked, when you get below pH 5.5, hydroxyapatite from your teeth starts to donate calcium and phosphate to the environment. Well, the same thing will happen in your toothpaste tube. You'll break down your hydroxyapatite and you'll just be left with calcium and phosphate. And if you neutralize that, you're not going to reform hydroxyapatite in your tube. You're just going to reform, like an orthophosphate.
Got it.
That is not going to be biomimetic and is not going to, have these benefits. The good thing is, typically people do not want to have acidic toothpaste because, putting an acid in your mouth and then scrubbing your teeth is not the best approach to keeping them healthy. So we don't run into that a lot. But you also need a lot of hydroxyapatite in your toothpaste.
Right.
So clinically, they've seen that you can formulate 10% and you're going to have a benefit against tooth decay that's similar to fluoride. Well, this is a very expensive undertaking. So, what we see is some toothpaste maybe have 10% hydroxyapatite, some have 5%, some have 2%, some have 1%, some have 0.1%. And, unless they're disclosing that, you have no way of knowing.
Yeah.
Wow. So fluoride is like our grinder and hydroxyapatite is like our match.
Love it.
Yeah. I'm not a crusader against fluoride, so I think for most people, brushing with fluoride is a smart choice. But, I think if, people should have autonomy over what they put in their body, first of all.
Agreed.
So
100%.
if you have concerns about brushing with fluoride, then you should seek an alternative. And hydroxyapatite is the best alternative we have. If you are, at higher risk to, potentially have an issue with fluoride, maybe, if you're pregnant, it might be concerning for you to brush with fluoride, or if you're, a young child, well, if you have young children, right, probably the parents' decision what they're brushing with. But if you have young children that, maybe don't have the mechanical control and aren't very good at expectorating the toothpaste after they're done brushing, you may not want to give them fluoride. So I think here we have, a very, for the most part, well-studied, long history of use, very good safety profile material that can be used as an alternative of fluoride to really help reduce tooth decay in the long run.
That actually, because it has been studied for so long, originating in the 70s, essentially, I was curious if you know anything about when it was deployed in the US and why it didn't make the monograph in any significant way.
I can speculate a little bit. I can make some sort of educated guesses.
Yeah. I know you know the history here, so I'm interested.
So the monograph system is industry driven, right? So the FDA essentially says, we've decided that preventing tooth decay is a drug, and we would like the industry to submit to us all the evidence that they have that supports that the ingredients that they're using and claiming prevent tooth decay are both safe and effective. And then the industry, submits all that data. And if you read through the anti-caries monograph, you'll see that, everything from, sodium fluoride and stannous fluoride and these fluoride products that are uh, all approved today to, calcium phosphate and different calcium salts were all approved. And, the fluorides were the only ones where at the time, and this process, I think it started, I want to say in the 70s, that's probably wrong. Into that monograph, I believe, was approved in the early 90s. So that's sort of the
Yes.
window where data was submitted and reviewed, and the FDA made their final decision. And since then, that's it. That's monograph has sort of been locked because we don't really have a good process for monograph reform. Hydroxyapatite was patented by NASA in the late 70s, and that patent was acquired by this Japanese company. So nobody had access to hydroxyapatite back then, right? Because this was the intellectual property of this Japanese company. Therefore, they were not making toothpaste with it. They were not generating safety or efficacy data with it. So it fundamentally could not have been part of the monograph process because it was IP from someone.
Understood. Yeah, the regulatory path here is steep. It's unfortunate that we can't have some revision for safe products that are in market and showing efficacy at this time. Speaking of efficacy, let's talk through some of the studies that, and let's make it clinical, because we can get into the weeds really swiftly with the in vitro studies. But to make it meaningful, and how are we feeling about the different types of formulas that we're going to encounter in market, and their efficacy in clinical trials specifically?
Where are we talking? In market in the United States?
Yes, please.
We're not feeling great.
Why is that?
I'd say it's because there's a general sort of lack of clinical data, to be, completely honest. So because, again, going back to that monograph discussion, right, because this was not included in that monograph, it's being used in the United States as a cosmetic ingredient. This is limiting, it's limiting what people can say about it, what brands can claim. They have to be careful not to claim things that would be drug claims, because then they're misbranded product, and they're subject to whatever the FDA wants to do about that.
Right.
So there's for manufacturers, there's pluses and minuses here. I think for consumers, there's mostly minuses. This is compared to other countries, right? In Japan, hydroxyapatite has been approved for tooth decay since 1993. In Canada, it's been approved since 2015. So in these countries, there are, regulations that dictate some requirements that have to be done by the manufacturers to support their claims. We have these types of requirements in place for fluoride products because of the monograph, right? So if you want to make a fluoride toothpaste, you have to use a certain fluoride salt at a specific level that's been approved. And then you also have to do certain testing that is dictated in this monograph to prove that that fluoride is available. In the case of hydroxyapatite, it's being used as a cosmetic ingredient. So there's not really any requirements to prove that it works. Of course, from the NAD front, from the sort of FTC you're a product and you're making a claim, you have to have support for that claim, or you'd be subject to fines from the FTC and class action lawsuits. So I believe that the manufacturers should all have some studies, but they may not be too, independent, double-blinded clinical studies. And again, because they're avoiding, very strong claims, things like, you might pick up a fluoride toothpaste that says, reduces cavities by X%, or, a stannous fluoride toothpaste that says, reduces plaque or gingivitis by X%. You're not going to find that on a hydroxyapatite toothpaste. On a hydroxyapatite toothpaste, you're going to find softer claims, things like remineralizes, or suitable for sensitive teeth. And the truth is, in 2025, we have such a wealth of information at our fingertips, right? On our cell phones, on our iPads, whatever you're using. You have so much access to education that the consumer knows what hydroxyapatite does. So they're going out there and they're looking for a toothpaste that has hydroxyapatite in it. And this makes things a lot easier for the manufacturer, because they don't have to, make these strong claims. Consumers know what the ingredient does, but it also makes sort of a risky scenario for the consumers, because there may not be, those products may not be doing what the customer thinks that they're doing, because
Sure.
they're
Well,
sort of.
to get into that exactly, if we look at the requirements in other countries, what are the things that we would want to look for if we were going to really be scrupulous in our analysis of each brand?
Well, I think the number one thing would be the concentration of hydroxyapatite in the product. So it's been shown clinically that at 10%, you're getting a benefit against tooth decay that is, I'm going to say, similar to fluoride. I think the clinical term is not inferior to fluoride. But the long story short is, they're showing a statistically significant reduction in tooth decay if you're brushing every day, twice a day, with a toothpaste that contains 10% hydroxyapatite. So I think, as a consumer in the United States, I would look for a brand that was disclosing the amount of hydroxyapatite in their toothpaste, first and foremost. And as an alternative to that, of course, you can sort of look for the position of that hydroxyapatite on the label. If it's very far down, if it's towards the end, if it's the last thing before the blue number one, it's probably not a good sign.
Right. So to that point, if I purchase on Amazon, because I can get everything there, if I purchase a product that is manufactured in Canada or Japan, would I be guaranteed the correct amount of hydroxyapatite?
I don't know. I don't know what the regulations require that they label. And I believe, at least in Canada, that they allow a range of hydroxyapatites.
Yeah.
But, as I mentioned earlier, right, that there's a range that's effective. So, you may get
Right.
a product with 2% hydroxyapatite, and it's likely not going to be as effective as a fluoride toothpaste, but it's probably going to be more effective than a toothpaste that doesn't have any remineralization.
Understood. That's fair. As far as I've heard of dentists kind of walking back how we use it and when to use it being maybe different than historically. Is this just because we're understanding the remineralization process that is naturally occurring? So what I'm talking about here is brushing my teeth when I wake up as opposed to after I eat. And I'm thinking of the chemistry that is happening for both my fluoride and hydroxyapatite.
Okay, so this is more broadly when to brush your teeth, not specifically about hydroxyapatite. Yeah,
Yeah, although I do have one remaining question, and that is regulatory speaking, is it nano hydroxyapatite that's required, or do they care?
I believe in Canada it is medical hydroxyapatite, which is sort of how they're classifying nano, um, to distinguish it from, again, hydroxyapatite that might be used as an abrasive or as an absorbing material. I don't know exactly what the size constraints are in that definition. I think in Canada, it is more broad, the particle size requirement. And, I'll say like the most respected clinical study, in my opinion, out there it was sponsored by a company called Carex in Germany. This is a German brand, and this is not a nano product.
Interesting. Yet effective.
This is, not inferior to fluoride.
Okay. And just so that we're all aware, fluoride stability can be a factor in the formulation. So, I mean, if I was going to pick a product off the shelf, I may pick one to compare that was not robust. So that's just a caveat to the research and understanding the formulation process in these chemicals. So back to the when to brush my teeth with these.
So personally, I brush my teeth after I eat in the morning. I think that makes sense. That's
Chemistry wise, or like I have food in my mouth now, so I would like that to go away.
I think it makes sense for a lot of reasons. I think I have food in my mouth. I want it to go away. I think I want to have nice breath, and brushing my teeth and then going and drinking coffee is not going to result in me having nice breath. And I think from a chemistry perspective, again, if you brush your teeth and you're leaving behind, whether you're precipitating calcium fluoride or you're having these hydroxyapatite particles stick to your biofilm, then you're going to go and eat and drink and do all this mechanical action, and you're going to dislodge that stuff. So I think you want to, have that sort of window after you brush your teeth where, you're not that much is going on in your mouth, and these things have, you go into remin and these things have time to work. And I think that's why I brush after I eat breakfast, and it's legitimately the last thing I do before I go to bed.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I am exactly the same. But I wanted to validate my experience. So here we are. Last, I am going to ask about the antimicrobial story on hydroxyapatite. There has been some murmurings around antimicrobial activity, I think specifically with the nano and not the micro.
Yes. So this has been talked about quite a bit, not so much as hypersensitivity and remineralization, but it's been, I think, I would say, a pretty active area of research. And what they found, they find a couple different things. One is that, they call it like anti-attachment, where they're basically saying, the bacteria, again, they want to stick to hydroxyapatite. They're not picky if it's your tooth enamel or if it's these hydroxyapatite particles. So the sort of main thing they've really been able to show is that bacteria will stick to these hydroxyapatite particles. If they're sticking to these particles, they're not sticking to your teeth. So, you have less plaque, so to speak, accumulating on the surface of your teeth. And of course, it's easier to remove because these particles are much easier to dislodge with brushing or maybe even, vigorous swishing. The second thing, and this is, they've done some like silver or zinc, I don't know, infused, loaded however you want to call it, hydroxyapatite, where they're sort of using hydroxyapatite to deliver these more established antibacterial ingredients. And they are showing, a benefit from this, but not, say, a benefit above and beyond just adding these materials to your toothpaste separately. And then the third thing, and I think this is really more or less what you're getting at, is these very small nanohydroxyapatite particles kind of interfering directly with the bacterial processes and maybe inhibiting some species of bacteria, particularly like SA, more than others. And I think there's maybe good in vitro support for this and not so good like practical support for this. Again, probably because a lot of those, nanoparticles are really forming these big clusters when you formulate them into a toothpaste. And, therefore they're not necessarily behaving that way. And, they can't in the mouth sort of do those things.
I very much appreciate that level of understanding. I think that as a microbiologist, I tend to align with the aggregate experience where um, you have a hydroxyapatite, little teeny tiny molecule in your mouth, and you're going to get deposition of our salivary proteins on it, which is naturally going to accumulate maybe some planktonic bacteria that are floating around, and maybe they won't re-sit themselves on your teeth, sure. But it's not, I wouldn't call that an antibacterial experience. That's more of a physical match. I'm coming back to match.
Yeah, and I just want to add a point about sort of this, this kind of aggregation. This is not a nanohydroxyapatite characteristic. This is like a nanoparticle in general characteristic. So, for those, that use like sunscreen,
Absolutely.
and, we know there's a lot in sunscreen about nano zinc and nano titanium dioxide and, improving, getting better SPF at lower concentrations because you use these smaller particles. But they have the same issue. And that's why, a lot of the nano zinc and nano titanium dioxide particles that are sold into the personal care industry are surface treated with something like a silicone derivative that's going to prevent this aggregation and keep them, more likely to stay in smaller aggregations or, individual particles. And, as of today, we're not there with nanohydroxyapatite, and, that may also impair the, the efficacy of nanohydroxyapatite, because if you're not hydroxyapatite on the surface, then your whole mode of action is turned upside down. I just think that's worthwhile for your listeners to kind of hear. This is a nano issue, not a hydroxyapatite issue.
Right. But I think it's fair to say that it could be working in an aggregate to remove bacteria, but that is not a true antimicrobial experience, if that makes sense. I think of as antimicrobial as somehow stunting the bacterial replication, function, metabolism, something, or killing, right?
I agree with you. I mean, I'm not a microbiologist, but yes, when I hear the word antimicrobial, I think, bacteriostatic or bactericidal. Yeah. I don't think like we're just going to give them a different substrate to bind. Those bacteria, I mean, whether they're on your teeth or they're on these HA particles, if they're still metabolizing sugar, they're still producing acid.
Yes, exactly. Well, this has been eye-opening for me. I definitely appreciate all the nuance involved in this molecule, and can absolutely see a benefit to its use in dentistry and oral health. Jonathan, I'm going to kick it to you.
Thanks again, Jason, for providing your expertise and your knowledge and these insights on hydroxyapatite. Before we let you go, I do have one more question for you. Are there any current books or other types of media that you're currently consuming that you could share with us in the audience?
Sure. Books. I'm not a huge book person. I think the most recent, and I'm going to be very clear, audiobook, because I've not picked up a physical book in a long time, but I consume lots of things through audio. The most recent audiobook I listened to that I think is worth listening to was Jim Comey's autobiography, the former head dude at the FBI under Obama and partially
Yes.
under Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the sort of those administrations through his perspective and kind of his view on leadership was worth consideration. And then the other thing I would say, I consume a good number of podcasts, and Chris Voss, he wrote a book that I read a long time ago. I Never Split the Difference. It was a book on negotiation. He's a former FBI negotiator. He's been doing the podcast circuit over the last couple months. So I've been taking in, him on some different podcasts here and there. So I definitely think those are worth listening to. I don't know if he's a good fit for Let's Get Oral, but
I can absolutely appreciate the art of negotiation. I think it was last year I took a negotiation course. I was invited to participate, and it was a really fun experience where it ends up feeling like you're naked on stage trying to make a deal. You're not, but it just feels very vulnerable, and they inspire people to kind of really work against you. And I definitely felt, like heartbroken by some of my dear friends who definitely got their negotiation and I did not. And I learned a ton from that. So I'm definitely interested in following up because I think I could improve.
Same. Definitely can learn and grow more. Even though I feel like I relatively advocate for myself well, but there's always room for improvement.
we can always get better. It
Yes.
doesn't matter. We've never reached the pinnacle. There's always room for growth.
Exactly. Well, Jason, thank you again for sitting down with us. It was a pleasure to be able to connect with you and chat about this topic. And if you're open to it, we'd love to have you back on the pod for more conversation, because I have a feeling this is definitely not the end of it.
No, hopefully it gets better.
I don't think this current topic is going to be out of the media anytime soon. But no, thank you guys for having me. It was fun. I hope your listeners get a lot out of it.
Me too.
Nerds like us, for some reason, enjoy talking about oral care.
Hey,
I know there's just a few of us, but I'm here for it.
Yeah.
You got to lean into your strengths,
Exactly.
Love it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Let's get